There is a question that most people never have to answer out loud. You have probably felt it before. That moment when something wrong is happening right in front of you and your body goes still and your mind goes blank and the only thought that keeps circling back is a quiet, terrible one. What if that were someone I love? Most people freeze. Most people look away. Most people tell themselves later that there was nothing they could have done. And maybe that is true. Or maybe it is just the story we tell ourselves so we can sleep at night. But on a cold Friday evening in October, in a small diner off Route 9 in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, one man did not have to ask himself that question, because the woman on the floor was his mother, and he had been sitting there the whole time. He had heard every word. The Silver Spoon Diner had been standing on the same stretch of highway since 1987. It was not the kind of place that showed up in travel magazines or got written about on food blogs. There were no artisan cocktails, no exposed brick, no carefully curated playlists pumping through hidden speakers. What it had was a long counter with red vinyl stools worn smooth from years of use, a row of booths along the window side with cracked laminate tables, fluorescent lights that cast everything in a warm yellow glow that made even tired faces look a little more human, and the smell of coffee and fried food and fresh baked pie that hit you the moment you opened the door and stayed with you long after you left. The man who built it had done most of the work himself. He had laid the tile, he had installed the counter, he had hung the lights and painted the walls and driven to 3 different lumber yards looking for exactly the right wood for the shelves behind the bar. His name was Raymond Calloway, and he had done all of that work with a piece of shrapnel still sitting in his left lung, a permanent resident from his second tour in Beirut, a souvenir the Army doctors had decided was safer to leave in than to take out. Ray had served 2 tours. He had come home from the first one quieter than he had left. He had come home from the second one with a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star, and a body that would spend the next 30 years slowly negotiating a peace with a piece of Lebanese steel. The Purple Heart was for covering a teammate. 3 rounds in the chest. He had lived. The Bronze Star was for pulling 3 men out of a kill zone after taking a round through the shoulder. All 3 had lived too. When people asked Ray about it, he would shake his head slightly and change the subject. Not because the memory was too painful to talk about, but because in Ray Calloway's understanding of the world, doing the right thing when it mattered was not a story worth telling. It was simply what you did. The fact that other people sometimes failed to do it was not a source of pride for him. It was a source of quiet sorrow. He opened Silver Spoon in October of 1987, the same month his youngest was born, with money from his disability benefit and a loan from a bank officer who happened to be a Korean War veteran and who signed the paperwork without reading past the applicant's name. Ray ran the diner for nearly 30 years. Then in 2015, the shrapnel that had kept its silence for so long began to make itself known in new and serious ways. He handed over day-to-day operations to his business partner. He fought for 2 years with the kind of quiet determination that had defined everything else in his life. He lost in the spring of 2017. He was 61 years old. His wife, Margaret, had sat beside his bed for 47 consecutive days in the final stretch. She had held his hand when he could no longer hold hers back. She had been the last thing he saw. After Ray was gone, Margaret sold her remaining stake in the business down to a small minority share. The new manager asked her once if she wanted her name on the door. She told him no. What she wanted, she said, was to keep working Thursdays and Fridays. The evening shift, 5 in the afternoon until 2 in the morning. He had started to say something about her age, about retirement, about how she did not need to do this anymore. She had looked at him with the kind of patience that only comes from having outlasted things that would have broken most people, and she had said, "I know I do not need to. That is not the point." He did not bring it up again. On the wall just inside the entrance to Silver Spoon, to the right of the front door, there was a small framed collection of photographs that the regulars had come to call Ray's Wall, though nobody had ever officially named it that. It had started with one photograph that Margaret had put up the week after the funeral, and over the years it had grown in the way that small memorials grow, when people who love someone keep finding new things to add. There was Ray, in his dress blues, standing at attention, 19 years old. The photograph slightly overexposed the way photographs from the early 80s often were. There was Ray and Margaret on their wedding day in 1984, both of them laughing at something that had happened just off camera, the kind of laugh that makes a photograph feel like a window instead of a document. There was Ray standing in front of the diner on the day it opened, holding up a set of keys with both hands, like a man who has just been handed something he cannot quite believe is real. And there was one more photograph, the one in the bottom right corner in the largest frame. It had been taken in the hospital. Ray in the bed, the tubes and the monitors doing their grim work in the background. Margaret beside him, her hand in his, both of them looking directly at the camera, both of them smiling. Not the smile of people in denial, not the smile of performance or bravado, the smile of two people who have been through something together for a very long time and who understand without needing to say it that what they built together was real and solid and true, and that no amount of shrapnel or time or bad luck could take that from them. That photograph said more about Raymond Calloway than his medals ever could. Most people who came into Silver Spoon walked right past it. Margaret Calloway was 64 years old, and she moved through the diner the way water moves through a landscape it has shaped over decades, without effort, without hesitation, without needing to think about where she was going because her body already knew. She remembered every regular's name and every regular's order. She remembered which booths had a wobble in the table leg and automatically put a folded napkin under it before anyone sat down. She remembered that Pete Farrell took his coffee with exactly one sugar, and that Earl Hutchins took his with nothing at all, and that the young couple who came in sometimes on Friday nights were still trying to figure out if they were in love with each other, and that the truck driver who stopped every third week and always ordered the same thing ate with the focused efficiency of a man who has learned not to waste the few quiet moments his life allows. She noticed things. She always had. On her left wrist, mostly hidden under an old leather band watch with a face that had clouded slightly with age, there was a thin green bracelet, the kind of bracelet that families of deployed soldiers wore, the kind that said, "I am waiting, I am holding on." Margaret had put it on in 1986 when Ray shipped out for his second tour. She had told herself she would take it off when he came home. She never did. 40 years later, it was still there. The first people to arrive that Friday night were the ones who always arrived. Earl Hutchins came in at 11 minutes past 11, exactly when he always did. He was 72 years old, built lean and angular, with the kind of face that had been weathered by enough decades that it had stopped aging and simply settled into permanence. He had done two things in his adult life: served in Vietnam, and then spent 28 years as a peace court judge in Lancaster County. He had retired 6 years ago and had not mentioned it to anyone at the diner, and nobody had thought to ask. He sat down at stool number 3, the same stool he had occupied every Friday night since 1989. He nodded to Margaret. She was already reaching for the coffee pot. Pete and Donna Farrell were at their usual booth near the window. Pete was 63, thick through the shoulders, with the careful movements of a man who had worked with heavy metal for 30 years and whose body had started to itemize its grievances. He had done a tour in the Gulf, come home, married Donna, worked as a welder until his hands told him enough. Donna had taught third grade at Lancaster Elementary for 3 decades and had the particular stillnesses of someone who has spent a career learning to read rooms full of unpredictable people. They came every Friday. They ordered the same things. They talked quietly and ate slowly, and when the check came, Pete always left a 20 on the table regardless of what the bill said. In the kitchen, Kevin Marsh was finishing up the prep work for the late rush that sometimes came and sometimes did not. He was 26 years old and 2 months into the job, and still a little in awe of the fact that Margaret had taken the time last Tuesday to teach him how to make apple pie from scratch, standing beside him at the prep counter, and talking him through it step by step with the patience of someone who understood that patience was itself a form of generosity. And at the far end of the counter, in the last stool before the wall, a large man sat with his back partly turned to the room. He was wearing a dark flannel shirt and heavy work boots and a baseball cap pulled low. He had ordered 1 cup of coffee when he came in and had not said another word since. He was not looking at his phone. He was not reading anything. He was simply sitting and drinking his coffee and watching the room in the quiet way of someone who has spent enough time in situations where watching the room was the difference between going home and not going home. Outside in the parking lot, if anyone had been paying attention to the far corner near the tree line, they would have noticed 5 Harley-Davidson motorcycles parked side by side in the dark engines, cold their riders gone inside. It was not the kind of detail that drew the eye. It was the kind of detail that mattered anyway. Margaret brought the man at the end of the counter a second cup without being asked. She set it down in front of him. He nodded. She nodded back. Neither of them said anything. Neither of them needed to. At 17 minutes past 11, 2 black SUVs pulled into the parking lot. The windows were tinted dark enough that you could not see inside until the doors opened. When they did, 4 men got out. The 3 who stepped out first were built along similar lines, thick through the neck, dressed in dark suits that were expensive, but not quite elegant, the kind of clothes that say money without saying taste. They moved with the practiced ease of men who were accustomed to entering rooms that immediately adjusted to accommodate them. The fourth man who came out was the one the room adjusted for. Vincent Rosario was 48 years old. He was 6 feet tall with the kind of build that had been genuinely athletic once and had since settled into something denser and more deliberate. His hair was dark with threads of gray at the temples swept back from his face. His suit was navy, clearly made to measure the kind of tailoring that was visible not in any particular detail, but in the way it sat on his body as if it had been born there. He wore a Rolex on his left wrist and a thick gold ring on the right index finger with a deep red stone that caught the light when he moved. He was not the boss. The boss was his father, an old man named Carmine, who had not left his house in 6 years and ran everything through intermediaries and telephone calls and the long-established weight of his reputation. Vincent was the hand. He was the one who appeared when appearing was required. He was the one whose name alone was enough to resolve most situations before they became situations. He walked into Silver Spoon Diner with the unconscious authority of a man who had not asked permission for anything in so long that the concept had become genuinely foreign to him. He looked around the room the way you look at something you might buy. His nose tightened slightly at the smell of grease and old vinyl. His eyes moved across the counter, the booths the kitchen passed through, and came to rest for a moment on the wall near the entrance. Ray's wall. He looked at it for perhaps half a second. Then he looked away and pulled out the largest table without checking whether it was clean and sat down. The man named Marco, who had been with him for 12 years, sat to his left. He was broad through the jaw and shoulders, the kind of man whose physical presence made rooms feel smaller, and he carried himself with the particular confidence of someone who has stood beside power long enough that some of it has transferred to him by proximity. The other two positioned themselves on the outside seats. The youngest of the group, a 23-year-old named Nico, who was Vinny's second cousin and had been brought along mostly because his father had asked as a favor, sat at the corner of the table with a laptop bag and the expression of someone trying to look like he belonged. Nico sat down and looked around the room in the way that young men in new situations look around rooms. His eyes found Ray's wall. He looked at the photographs. He looked at the one in the center, the young man in military dress, the posture of someone who has already been somewhere most people will never go. He looked for a moment longer than he meant to, then looked back at his phone. Margaret came out from behind the counter with her order pad and a pen and walked to the table the way she had walked to 10,000 tables over 19 years. "Good evening. What can I get you all started with?" Marco did not look up. He said, "Menu water, no ice." The words came out flat without inflection, the grammatical structure of a sentence with all the social courtesy drained out of it. Not rude in an aggressive way, rude in the way of a man who simply did not think the person he was speaking to required courtesy. Margaret wrote it down and went to get the menus. When she came back, Vincent Rosario was looking at her. Not the way you look at someone you are trying to understand, the way you look at something you are trying to categorize. His gaze moved from her face to her hands, to the worn-down heels of her shoes, and back up again with the thoroughness of a man making an assessment and arriving at a verdict. "How old are you?" he said. "Still doing the night shift at your age." 64, she said. "What would you like to order?" Her voice was the same as it always was, even, unhurried, the voice of someone doing a job they have done long enough to be entirely at peace with it. Vinny kept looking at her for a moment. He had expected something to shift in her. A small adjustment in her posture, a flicker behind the eyes, some indication that his observation had found its mark. She was writing on her pad. He looked back at the menu. The steak was the first problem. He ordered it medium rare. Margaret wrote it down as well done. When the plate came out, he looked at it and put his fork down. "I said medium rare." Margaret turned back. She opened her pad, found the line, and read it back to him in the same level voice. "Well done." She had it written right here. The shift in the room was subtle but real, like the change in air pressure before weather moves in. Pete Farrell set down his fork. Earl Hutchins turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on the counter. Kevin appeared at the kitchen pass-through window without being entirely aware he had moved there. Vinny said, "Are you telling me I said the wrong thing? Or are you telling me you wrote it wrong?" "I can have the kitchen make you a new one," Margaret said. "It will take about 15 minutes. I don't wait 15 minutes for other people's mistakes. I won't charge you for the first one." There was a pause, the kind of pause that happens when someone says something so direct and practical that the other person's prepared response has nowhere to go. Vinny looked at her. She was holding the plate and waiting. "Take it back," he said. "Make a new one, and do it right this time." Margaret picked up the plate and turned toward the kitchen. She did not apologize. She did not explain. She simply turned and walked away with the same unhurried step, and the room exhaled slightly, and the regular sounds of the diner resumed around the edges of the table where Vinny sat. At the end of the counter, the man in the flannel shirt had not moved. His coffee cup sat in front of him. His hands were folded on the counter. His eyes were forward. The second steak came out in 12 minutes. It was exactly medium rare. It was exactly what had been ordered. Vinny cut into it, ate one bite, set down his silverware. Bland, he said. Margaret was nearby refilling Earl's cup. She turned. I can bring you additional seasoning if you'd like. It's not a seasoning problem. His voice had changed slightly. Not louder, lower. The shift that happens when performance becomes intention. He was looking around the table now, addressing the room as much as the woman in front of him. The problem is nobody here knows how to do their job. The kitchen doesn't know how to cook. The service is slow. This place looks like it should have been shut down 10 years ago. He said it loud enough that the room had no choice but to receive it. Kevin heard it through the kitchen window. Pete Farrell put both hands flat on the table. Donna watched Margaret's face. And then Vinny looked directly at Margaret and said, "What's the saddest part, you, 64 years old, working nights alone in a place like this? Where are your children? You would think they would take better care of you at this point." The question was not a question. It was a particular kind of weapon that people use when they want to hurt someone in a way that looks like concern. It targeted the one thing that most people of a certain age and circumstance carry quietly, the fear of having been left behind, the fear of being looked at and found lacking. Margaret met his gaze. "My son doesn't need to worry about this," she said. Her voice did not change. That was the thing about Margaret Calloway that Vincent Rosario could not find a way around. She had heard the weapon in the question, and she had looked at it, and she had simply declined to be wounded by it, the way a person declines who has already survived something much larger and knows the difference between the two. "Or maybe he doesn't care enough to worry," Vinny said, turning to Marco. He said it as a performance now aimed at the table at the room. "Mother working nights alone, and the son doesn't even check in." He shook his head with the theatrical sympathy of a man who feels none. Marco smiled slightly. The two other men at the table made sounds of agreement. Margaret moved to the next table. She was done. The man at the end of the counter set his coffee cup down on the saucer with a quiet, deliberate care that had nothing to do with being careful with the cup. Earl Hutchins, in his peripheral vision, registered the movement. He looked at the man for 1 second. Then he looked back at his own coffee. The apple pie came out, and Vinny pushed it to the side of the table without eating it. He drank the coffee. He said it tasted like dishwater. He said it loud enough that Kevin could hear it from the kitchen. Kevin had gone still at the pass-through. He was watching. He was trying to understand what was happening and what he was supposed to do about it, and whether there was anything he could do about it, and whether the fact that he was doing nothing made him the kind of person he did not want to be. Pete Farrell had put down both his fork and his knife. His hands were resting on the table. Donna had moved her hand to her coffee cup and was holding it with both palms, the way people hold on to something warm when they need something to hold. Vinny stood up from the table. He stretched slightly, adjusted his jacket. He was going to the restroom, which meant crossing the length of the diner, which meant walking past the counter. He walked without hurrying. He glanced at the photographs on Ray's wall as he passed, the same half-second he had given them when he came in. Then he was past them and gone. He was back within 4 minutes. Margaret was near the table again, carrying a tray with fresh water. She was returning to begin clearing the dinner things. She moved with the easy efficiency of someone whose body knew the work better than her mind needed to. She was not looking at him. She was doing her job. He stopped beside her. He said it again, the same line as before, but this time stripped of its thin pretense of curiosity. "Just the instrument itself, woman your age, working nights, alone, no one looking after you." He said, "You know what that looks like? My children look after me." "Just fine," Margaret said. "You don't need to concern yourself with that." She turned to continue back toward the counter. What happened next was not the result of anger escalating past a breaking point. Vinny was not a man who lost control. What he was in this moment was offended in the particular way that powerful men get offended when someone they have decided is beneath them refuses to perform their smallness. 3 times he had aimed something at this woman, and 3 times she had simply continued working, and the steadiness of her refusal to be diminished had become, in the architecture of his ego, a provocation that required a response. He raised his foot, and he kicked the back of her right knee, sudden and hard, the way you bring someone down, not because you mean to start a fight, but because you want them on the floor. Margaret went down. Her left knee hit the tile first. The impact was immediate and hard. Her body tilted sideways as she tried to catch herself, and the tray left her hand, and the glasses hit the floor, and the sound of it rang out through the diner like something breaking. That was not only the glass. Her right hand reached for the edge of a chair and missed, and her left cheek struck the wooden corner of the armrest as she went fully down, a solid impact that sent a single hard sound through the room. Then silence. Complete silence. The kind of silence that follows something so viscerally immediately wrong that the people who witness it cannot yet process the distance between what they just saw and what they believed was possible in the world they were living in. Donna Farrell made a sound with her mouth closed that was not quite a word, her hands pressed flat on the table in front of her. Pete Farrell stood up. He stood up without thinking about it, the way a man stands when his body has made a decision before his mind has had time to weigh in. He was halfway around the table before one of Vinny's men stepped into his path, not touching him, just standing there, the physical grammar of a wall. Pete stopped. He was breathing hard. His hands were at his sides, and they were not still. He looked at Vinny. Then he sat back down, and his hands remained where they were, curled against his thighs, trembling with everything they were not being allowed to do. Kevin had come out of the kitchen. He was standing at the doorway between the dining room and the kitchen quarter, not fully in either space. He was staring at Margaret on the floor. His face had gone the color of something that had lost all its heat. His right hand moved to his pocket. Marco had stood. He was not looking at Maggie. He was looking at the end of the counter. And the man at the end of the counter was standing up. The stool scraped back across the tile floor. The baseball cap fell off when he rose and landed on the counter and stayed there. He was bigger standing than he had looked sitting. The flannel shirt, the lean cut of his shoulders, the way he had folded himself onto the stool for the past hour had obscured it. Standing, he was the kind of size that rooms acknowledge. He stood still for one moment. Then he began to walk. Not fast, not with the charged forward energy of someone running toward a confrontation. He walked the way water moves downhill, with full commitment to direction and without any apparent effort. The distance between the end of the counter and the place where Margaret had gone down was not long. He covered it in 8 steps. He did not look at Vinny as he walked. He was looking at his mother on the floor. He crouched down beside her. His hands moved to her knee first, then to her face, fingers curved gently against her cheekbone, where the chair had caught her. The touch was careful in a way that comes from training, from having checked people for damage in places far less safe than this, from having learned the difference between assessing an injury and causing another one. Mom. One word, low and quiet. The whole room heard it. Margaret looked up at him. Whatever she had held in place across the last hour, the steady voice and the level gaze and the uninterrupted composure did not collapse when she saw his face. But something shifted behind her eyes, something that had no clean name and did not need one. The expression of a person who has been carrying something alone for a long time and has just been told they can put it down now if they choose. Danny, she said, I'm all right. He looked at her knee. He looked at her cheek. Knee is scraped, he said quietly and without drama, reading it like a field report. Cheek's going to bruise. But you're okay. He held her arm as she sat up, taking the weight where she needed it and giving her room to do the rest herself. When she was sitting, he checked her again. When he was satisfied, he helped her to her feet. He did it slowly, precisely, like a man completing a task that required accuracy. When she was standing and he could feel that she was stable, he let go of her arm. He stood up straight. He turned around. And for the first time since rising from that stool, Vincent Rosario came into his field of vision. He looked at him. He did not speak yet. He simply looked with the settled attention of a man who had made all his decisions already and was now proceeding through them in order. There was nothing leaking from him. No heat, no trembling, no forward pressure. Just a man standing in the middle of a diner holding a complete and unambiguous awareness of what had just happened and what came next. Vinny had spent enough time around dangerous people to know that the most dangerous ones were not the ones who leaked. They were the ones who had learned to contain it so completely that the containment itself had become a kind of warning. He looked into Danny Calloway's eyes and felt something that he had not felt in a very long time. Something that bypassed his usual categories and landed in a register that was older and more honest than anything his position had taught him. He did not know yet who this man was. He was already beginning to understand that it mattered. You just kicked my mother. 4 words. Danny let them sit in the air of the Silver Spoon Diner, the way you let something heavy settle before you decide what to do about it. He was not filling the silence. He was not waiting for a response. He was giving the room time to understand what had just been stated because clarity was more useful than volume. Vinny said, "Who are you?" Not a question with genuine curiosity in it. A question as a recalibration tool. Danny did not answer right away. He looked at his mother once more, making sure she was steady on her feet. Then he looked back at Vinny. "He said I was sitting at the end of that counter when you walked in. I heard everything. From the first question about her age to the part where you decided her children must not care enough to check on her." He let that land. "I'm right here." The room absorbed what those three words contained. They were not said with heat or with the performance of a man making a point. They were said with the flat certainty of a fact being recorded. And in the Silver Spoon Diner at 25 minutes past 11 on a cold Friday night in October with the woman's handprint visible on the tile where she had tried to catch herself, those three words rearranged everything that had come before them. Pete Farrell looked up. He understood it immediately, and understanding it did something to him that his face could not entirely contain. He had been sitting 10 feet away, and he had not stood up fast enough, and he had sat back down, and the shame of that had been sitting in his chest for the past 3 minutes. And here was this man saying he had been here, had heard everything, had waited, and had moved at exactly the moment when moving was required. Pete could not have explained why that specific thing hit him the way it did. He could not have put words to the particular shape of the feeling. He just felt it in the chest below, where words live. Donna put her hand over Pete's hand on the table. Kevin, standing in the kitchen doorway, had his phone in his hand. He had not decided yet what to do with it. He was watching the man in the flannel shirt, and he was remembering something from the diner wall near the entrance. Something he had walked past every day for 2 months without looking at carefully, and he was beginning to look at it carefully now. Vinny said, "I don't know who you are, but this conversation is finished." It was the kind of sentence that had ended conversations for him before, delivered in the voice that carried the accumulated weight of a great many rooms that had rearranged themselves at its instruction. Danny let it finish. Then he said, "I'd like you to look at that wall." He nodded toward Ray's wall near the entrance. Vinny did not turn. Marco turned. He had been looking in that direction since the moment Danny had stood up, since the moment he had seen the tattoo on the man's neck, the eagle and the anchor and the two words below them, USMC, Semper Fidelis. He had looked at the photographs. He had looked at the one in the center. He had looked back at Danny. He sat down without a word. Nico at the corner of the table watched Marco sit. He looked at the photographs on the wall. He looked at Danny. He looked at the tattoo. He reached slowly into his jacket pocket. His fingers found his phone. He did not know yet what he was going to do with it. He kept it in his hand. Danny spoke. He spoke in the same low, even voice he had used since standing up. Not a storytelling voice, not a performance. The voice of someone reading into the record something that needed to be there. He said the man in the center photograph, the one in the dress uniform. He did 2 tours. First one was 1983. Second was 1986, both Beirut. He paused. He came home from the first one quiet. He came home from the second one with a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star and a piece of shrapnel in his left lung that the doctors said was safer to leave alone than to remove. The diner was very still. Even the highway outside seemed to have quieted. The Purple Heart was for covering a teammate. He took 3 rounds in the chest doing it. His teammate lived. The Bronze Star was for pulling 3 men out of a kill zone after he had already been hit in the shoulder. All 3 of them lived too. He paused again. Earl Hutchins had not moved at all. He was looking at his coffee cup, but the angle of his head had changed in the way a man's head changes when he is listening with his whole body. He came home in 1987. Danny continued. He took his disability pay and a loan from a bank officer who was a Korean War veteran, and he built this diner with his own hands. He laid that floor. He hung those lights. He installed the counter you have been sitting at all night. He built this place. He looked at Vinny. He died in 2017. The shrapnel moved. After 30 years of being quiet, it moved, and by the time anyone understood what was happening, it was already too late. The fluorescent lights hummed. The highway outside breathed its low, continuous breath. The woman you put on the floor tonight sat next to his bed for 47 days before he died. She held his hand when he could not hold hers anymore. She was the last thing he saw. He let that sentence exist by itself. That was my father. That wall is his wall. This diner is the place he built. And this woman has been coming here every Thursday and Friday for 7 years since he died because this is where he put something of himself and she is not ready to stop being near it. He looked at Vinny directly. You asked where her children were. I am right here. I have been here every Friday for 7 years. The room was not the same room it had been 10 minutes ago. The weights on things had shifted. The molecules of the air itself seemed to have rearranged. Donna Farrell was crying without sound, tears running down her face in the way they run down the face of someone not fully aware they are crying. Pete stared at Ray's wall with an expression that the soft light made hard to read, but that anyone who had served would have recognized without needing to. Nico had moved from the table. He had moved to the edge of the room near the window quietly in the way that young men who are not sure of their own instincts move when an instinct is telling them something they have not heard before. He had his phone raised at a slight angle. He had been holding it that way for the past 3 minutes. He looked at Ray's wall. He looked at Danny. He looked at the photograph of the man on his wedding day laughing at something just off camera, and the photograph of the man on his opening day holding up his keys, and the photograph in the hospital with the joined hands and the smiles that said, "We know what this is and we are not afraid." He pressed the call button. He angled the phone so the camera faced the room. He said one word into the receiver quietly in the direction of the floor. "No, no." His grandfather picked up on the second ring. Earl Hutchins set his coffee cup down on the counter. He did it with the deliberateness of a man who has learned that physical actions can carry weight when words have been used up, and he turned on his stool until he was facing the room. He looked at Vinny Rosario. "I have been sitting at this counter since 1989, he said. His voice was dry and unhurried. The voice of someone who had spent decades in rooms where the quality of what was said mattered more than the speed at which it was delivered. Every Friday night near enough. I came in the first time because it was the only place open past 11. Ray Calloway brought me a cup of coffee and sat down and talked with me for 2 hours. Not because he needed conversation, because he could see I did. He let that sit. I knew this woman before most of the people in this room met her. I was at the service when her husband died. I have sat in this seat every Friday since." He looked directly at Vinny, not with heat, with the cool and complete attention of a man who has spent a long time watching people under conditions of high importance and has learned to make his watching felt. "I spent 28 years as a peace court judge in this county," Earl said. "I have seen a great many people walk into a great many rooms and behave in ways they later wish they had not. In my experience, the ones who do what you did tonight always believe at the time that there will be no accounting for it." He picked up his coffee cup, drank from it, set it down. They are always wrong about that. He turned back to face the counter. He was finished. The room held what he had said in the same way it was holding everything else, layering it, building the weight. Vinny's jaw tightened by a fraction. It was the only visible sign that the room was reaching him, and it was small enough that most people would have missed it. Marco did not miss it. The front door opened. 4 men came in. They came in quietly without announcement or display, spreading as they entered, so that they occupied the full width of the doorway and then the space just inside it. They were all wearing the same thing: black leather jackets, dark jeans, boots. Their faces were different, but their posture was the same. The posture of men who were not there to be seen so much as to be known about. On the back of each jacket, visible now as they turned slightly to take in the room, was the same design: a wolf's head in profile, stylized and angular. Below it in arc lettering, Iron Wolves MC, and below that Lancaster chapter. They did not speak. They did not move further into the room. They simply stood at the entrance, and the room received their presence the way a room receives the arrival of weather. Vinny looked at them. He read the lettering on the jackets. Something moved behind his eyes, a rapid interior processing that showed itself only in the slight sharpening of focus, the way a man's gaze changes when two pieces of information connect, and their combined weight is greater than either one alone. He looked at Danny. He looked at the left breast of Danny's flannel shirt, at the small embroidered detail there that he had not noticed before or had noticed and dismissed. The same wolf's head, and below it in small letters, President. Marco said very quietly without looking up from the table, "Vinny, just the name, nothing else." But the way he said it carried the full weight of a longer sentence. Danny had not looked at the men who had come through the door. He had not needed to. He had known they were in the parking lot. They had been there since before 11, same as every Friday. This was not a plan made tonight. It was an arrangement that had existed for 7 years, unspoken and reliable, the way the most dependable arrangements often are. Danny came here on Friday nights. The men who rode with him knew where he was. They waited. On most nights, waiting was all that was required. Tonight was not most nights. Vinny looked from the 4 men at the door to Danny and back again. He was doing the arithmetic. He had done this arithmetic before in other configurations, and he knew what the answer was, and what it told him tonight was that the room had changed in a way that could not be reversed. He said to Marco, "Look at the room." Marco had been looking at the room since the moment Danny stood up. He had been quietly revising his understanding of the evening since the first time he had seen the USMC tattoo on the man's neck and looked at the photographs and understood what the connection was. He had been arriving in his own time and in his own way at a conclusion that did not require anyone else's help. He said, yeah. Vinny's phone rang. He reached into the inside pocket of his vest and took it out. He looked at the screen. The name on it was one word, Papa. Nobody else could read it from where they were standing, but the change in Vinny's face when he saw it was visible to the room. He stood very still for a moment with the phone lit up in his hand, and then he said in a voice that was the quietest he had used all night, "Excuse me." He walked to the front door. The four men at the entrance stepped apart without being asked, creating a path. He went through it and out into the parking lot, and the door swung shut behind him. The room breathed. Through the front windows, he was visible as a shape in the dark, the phone against his ear. He was not pacing. He was standing still as he had stood still all night, because stillness was his default mode, the posture he had learned to hold through things that required it. But he was standing differently than he had been standing inside. The difference was subtle. The shoulders that had carried themselves with the absolute assurance of a man who walks into rooms and rearranges them were still. But the quality of the stillness had changed. Something in the set of them was working at something it had not been working at when he came in. Kevin looked at his phone. He looked at Danny. Danny gave a small single nod. Kevin stepped back through the kitchen doorway, and a moment later the sound of him dialing came quietly through the pass-through window. Margaret crossed the diner floor to the booth where Pete and Donna Farrell were sitting. She moved without hurrying, without announcement, and she put her hand on Pete Farrell's shoulder. Pete looked up. His eyes were red at the edges. He was not a man who cried easily or often, but the evening had done something to him that sitting still had not been sufficient to contain. Margaret said, "You don't need to do anything, Pete. Danny has it." Pete said, "Maggie, I should have gotten up sooner." She pressed his shoulder gently. She said, "You were here. That's what matters. You stayed in the room." Donna reached across and put her hand over Margaret's hand where it rested on Pete's shoulder. 3 hands. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Margaret straightened, took the paper napkin from her apron pocket, and offered it to Donna, who took it. She turned and walked back behind the counter. She poured herself a glass of water and drank half of it, standing up. Earl was watching her, not with concern exactly, with the particular attention of someone who has been watching this woman for a long time and understands that she processes things in her own order and at her own pace, and that the most respectful thing you can do is let her. She set the glass down. She looked at the pass-through window. "Kevin," she said. A beat. Then his voice came back through. "Yes, ma'am. You sure you're okay?" Another beat. "I called 911, he said, right after you fell. I hope that was right." Margaret looked at the window for a moment. "That was right," she said. Vinny came back through the door. He walked through the space the 4 men made for him, and he came to the center of the room and he stopped. He was not the same as when he had gone out. The difference was not dramatic. He had not been brought low in any visible theatrical way. His suit was still the same suit. His posture was still upright. His face was still composed with the careful craft of a man who has spent a lifetime not letting rooms read him. But something had moved behind the eyes. He did not look at Marco. He did not look at Nico. He did not look at Danny. He looked at Margaret. She was behind the counter, glass of water on the surface in front of her, watching him with the same levelness she had maintained since the first minute he walked in the door. He said, "I want to talk to you, alone." Danny, standing near the counter, looked at his mother. Margaret looked at her son. She said, "Danny, it's all right." He looked at her face, and he read it the way you learn to read the faces of the people who shaped you, and he understood what she was telling him. He took a step back. Not out of the room, not to the far end of the counter, just back. Enough. Vinny pulled out the chair closest to the counter and sat down across from Margaret. He sat the way someone sits when they are no longer in charge of the frame of a conversation and are searching for their footing in a new one. He put his phone face down on the counter between them. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "My father just called me." Margaret waited. He said, "My father knows the name Ray Calloway." The room was very quiet. He said, "He did not give me details. He never gives details. But he knew the name, and he called me. And he told me in the way that he tells me things when he is serious that he did not want to hear that I had been here tonight. That he did not want to hear that I had done anything in connection with this place or with anyone in it." He paused. "My father does not call often. When he calls, you understand why." He was not making an excuse. He was not offering this as mitigation. He was stating geography. Here is where I am standing so the conversation can begin from the right place. Margaret looked at him. She let him finish. And then she said something that nobody in the room was expecting because it was not a response to what he had told her. It was something that had been waiting in her all evening, sitting behind the steady voice and the composed hands, waiting for the room to be honest enough to receive it. She said, "Do you know what Ray used to say about men like you?" Vinny looked at her. She said he did not hate them. He felt sorry for them. And she said it without unkindness and without performance, the way you say something you have believed for a long time. He used to say that a man who has to push someone else down to feel tall is a man who is very, very short on the inside. And he knows it. That is why he keeps pushing. Because every time he stops, the shortness comes back. The room was absolutely still. She said, "You are not a bad man by nature. Nobody starts out that way. But every time you do what you did tonight, you choose it again. And each time you choose it, it becomes a little easier to choose. That is the thing that should frighten you. Not what happened here tonight, what it costs you to keep being the man who does this." She picked up her water glass and held it. "Your father called you," she said, "because he was ashamed. Not of this situation, of you. And he wanted you to know that. That is why fathers call." The honesty of it was not cruel. It was complete. She had no investment in softening it for his comfort and no investment in sharpening it for her own satisfaction. She was simply clear in the way that people become clear when they have been through enough to stop caring what their clarity cost them. Vinny sat with it. He sat with it the way you sit with something you cannot argue against because the ground beneath the argument keeps giving way. After a long moment, he said, "I'm sorry." He said it as if he were handling something fragile. Margaret looked at him. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said, "All right. Not I forgive you. Not it does not matter. Just an all right." The acknowledgement of a fact that had been placed into the record and could now stay there. Marco had been watching all of it. He had been watching since the moment Danny stood up from the end of the counter, and he had been watching quietly ever since, the way a man watches when he is revising something internally, when the version of a situation he walked into is being replaced by a version that is both different and more accurate. He stood up from the table. He walked not to where Vinny was sitting, and not to Danny, but to the counter where Margaret stood. He stopped in front of her. He said, "You remind me of my mother." He said it carefully, the way you say something for the first time that you have not said before. "She worked nights too," he said, something like this. "She's still around?" Margaret asked. He shook his head. "I'm sorry," she said. It was not a platitude. It was the same directness she had given everything else all evening. The simple acknowledgement of one person's loss by another who understood what that specific loss felt like in the body. Marco stood there for a moment. Then he looked at Vinny. He said, "Vinny, we should go." He said it without aggression and without apology, as one clear statement of what needed to happen from a man who had been watching all night and had arrived on his own at a conclusion. Kevin came out of the kitchen. He was still holding his phone, and his face still had some of the color missing from it, the particular pallor of a young man whose body has been running on adrenaline for an hour and is now beginning to process the fact that it is time to come down. He said, "I've been recording since you fell, Mrs. Calloway, and I already called. They're on their way." He said it like a man completing a report, factual and clear. Earl reached inside his jacket and set something on the counter. A small compact camera, the kind that had been out of fashion for 15 years, and that almost nobody carried anymore, the kind that a man of a certain generation might keep in a coat pocket out of a habit formed long ago and never examined. He set it down without comment. He said, "I started shooting when the second steak came out. I had a feeling about the evening." Then Donna Farrell reached across the table and turned her phone so the screen was visible. The red recording dot was still lit in the corner. She said, "I have been recording since he knocked over the first glass." Pete stared at his wife. She said, without looking at him, still looking at the screen, "Last year there was an incident at a diner on Route 4. Nobody had anything. Nobody could prove what happened. I told myself I would not let that happen again." Pete looked at his wife for a long time. Then he looked down at the table and he let out a slow, long breath that had been waiting a while to be released. 4 sources, 4 separate recordings, 4 people who had each independently and without coordination made the same decision. The decision was simple, as such decisions usually are, in retrospect, however complicated they feel in the moment. They had decided that what was happening in front of them was not something that should be permitted to simply evaporate into the air of an October night, unwitnessed and unaccounted for. Each of them had decided this alone. Nobody had asked them. Nobody had organized them. They had simply done it because it was the thing to do. Danny looked at the four devices on the table and the counter. He looked at the people who had produced them. The cook in his 20s, the retired judge, the former soldier and his schoolteacher wife. He said, "This did not come from me. None of you were asked." He let that sit. He said, "What you did is what a community looks like when it actually works. People watching out for each other without being told to. Deciding on their own that some things are not acceptable and doing something about it regardless of who else is in the room." He paused. He said, "My father believed in that. He spent his whole life trying to be an example of it." He looked at Ray's wall. "I think he would have recognized tonight," he said. The blue and white lights came through the windows first. Then the sound of the vehicle in the parking lot. Then the door opened and Sheriff Dave Kowalski came in. He was 58 years old, built solidly with gray at his temples and the deliberate, unhurried movement of a man who had been doing this long enough to know that arriving in a hurry rarely improved anything. He had a deputy with him who positioned himself near the entrance and stayed there. Kowalski looked at the room. He had been coming to the Silver Spoon Diner for a long time for coffee and for pie, and twice before for incidents that had required official documentation, and he knew this space the way you know a place where you have long been welcome. He knew which stool was Earl's. He knew what Margaret's face looked like on a normal Friday night. He looked at her face now, and it was not what a normal Friday night looked like, and he crossed the room directly. Maggie. Dave. He looked at her cheek, which had begun to show the early spread of bruising along the cheekbone. "You okay?" "I'm okay." He checked her knee briefly. She told him it was scraped. He nodded. Then he looked at Danny. The two men regarded each other in the way of people who share a long piece of history and do not need to rehearse it. Kowalski had been to Ray's funeral. He had shaken Danny's hand at the graveside in the cold November air 7 years ago, and they had not needed many words for it then either. He said to Danny, "Where are they now?" Danny said, "Parking lot. 2 vehicles. They were moving when I last saw." Kowalski turned and said something brief to his deputy, who went back out through the front door. Then Kowalski pulled out a chair and sat down across from Margaret and took out his notebook, and the careful work of assembling the evening into a form that could be carried forward began. He took their statements one at a time. Margaret first. She told him what had happened from the beginning, clearly and without embellishment and without leaving anything out the way she did everything. Then Kevin, who walked Kowalski through the recording on his phone and the call he had placed his voice steadier now than it had been the act of having done the right thing in the moment having restored something in him. Then Earl, who offered his camera with the same dry economy with which he offered everything. Then Donna, who turned over her recording. Then Pete, who stated what he had seen fully and without omission, including the part where he had stood up and been blocked and sat back down, which he stated without flinching, because it was true and therefore belonged in the record. Kowalski wrote it all down. He was thorough and he was patient and he was particular about the sequence and the specific words used in the precise physical action and its physical result. When he had finished, he stepped outside, briefly spoke on his radio, came back in. He said to the room, "The vehicles have been located. There will be follow-up. The evidence you have provided is substantial. The witness count is significant. This is not a situation that is likely to be walked away from." He looked at Danny. He said Ray would have handled this the same way. He said it not as comfort, but as observation, as someone who had known the man well enough to know what he would have done. Danny said, "Yeah, he would have." Kowalski put his notebook away. He looked at Margaret one more time with the expression of a man who wants to say more than his professional context allows and is making peace with the limitation. He said, "You call me directly if anything develops. You have the number." She said, "I have the number, Dave." He nodded. He said good night to Earl, who nodded back. He told Pete and Donna that what they had done mattered. Then he and his deputy went out, and the sound of the county vehicle leaving was quieter than the SUVs had been, but somehow more settled. Vinny and his men had gathered near the front during the taking of statements. They had waited in the way that people wait when the room is no longer theirs, and they understand that. When Kowalski was done with them, they moved toward the door. At the door, Vinny stopped. He turned back, not to Danny, not to Earl or Pete or the room in general. He turned to Ray's wall. He stood in front of it, and he looked at it the way he had not looked at it either of the previous times he had passed it. He looked at the photographs one by one. The young man in dress blues with his whole life still in front of him. The couple laughing on their wedding day at something off camera. The man with the keys in front of the building he had built from nothing. And the last one, the largest frame, the hospital room, the 2 people whose hands were joined and whose faces said something that no amount of money or carefully tailored clothing could purchase or replicate. He stood there and he looked, and the room let him look, and nobody spoke. Margaret stood behind the counter, and she watched Vincent Rosario look at photographs of her husband. She did not say a word because there was nothing left to say that the photographs had not already said better. When Vinny finally turned away from the wall, something had changed. Not in the furniture or the light or the people standing in it. In him. The change was small and it was real, and everyone who was watching could see it, and seeing it was the thing the evening had been quietly building toward since the moment he walked through the door. He did not look at Danny. He looked at Margaret. He said, "I'm sorry about your husband, not about tonight, about Ray." Margaret looked at him. She said, "I know you are." He went out the door. Marco paused in the doorway. He looked at Margaret once more with the expression of a man who is carrying something he has no language for yet, and who knows that finding the language for it will be his own work to do on his own time. He gave her a single nod, small and specific, the kind that carries more than it shows. Then he went out. The other two followed. Then Nico. He stopped at the threshold and he looked back at the room and at Ray's wall and at the woman standing behind the counter with her water glass, and his face showed the particular expression of someone who is 23 years old and has just watched something they will not forget for the rest of their life, and who is not entirely sure what to do with that yet. Then he went out too. The door swung closed behind him. The two black SUVs started up in the parking lot, one and then the other, and the sound of them diminished and was gone. The Silver Spoon Diner settled into the quiet that comes after. It is a particular kind of quiet, the quiet that exists in a space after something significant has passed through it, when the people who remain are the ones who were present for all of it and are now in the process of returning to themselves. It is not the quiet of emptiness. It is the quiet of something having been deposited in a place, something that will remain there even after the people have gone home and gone to sleep. Pete and Donna Farrell stayed in their booth for a while without ordering anything else. The coffee had gone cold. Neither of them touched it. After a while, Pete said she stood up in the middle of all of that to come check on me. He said it quietly, looking at the table. Donna said, "I know." He said she was the one who got hurt tonight, and she walked over to put her hand on my shoulder and tell me it was all right. Donna said, "I know Pete." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Ray raised a hell of a woman." Donna said Ray was raised by one too. That is generally how it works. Pete looked at his wife. He looked at her with the specific attentiveness that long marriages develop the ability to see a person fully after decades together in a way that is different from the seeing of early love, but is, if anything, more complete. He said, "Yeah." After a while, they put their coats on. Pete left a 20 on the table, same as always. Donna held the door for him. He stopped in the doorway and looked back at the room, one time at Ray's wall, at Margaret behind the counter, at Danny on the stool at the far end. Then they went out into the October night. Kevin finished closing down the kitchen. He moved through it with the rhythm he had been learning over the past 2 months, the sequence of tasks that needed to happen in order to leave the space ready for the next day. He washed the last of the prep dishes. He wiped down the counters. He covered the pie cases. Before he left, he came back out to the dining room and he stood in front of Margaret. He started to say something. He stopped. He tried again. He said, "I want you to know that I'm going to be here next Thursday, and the Thursday after that." It was not the most eloquent thing that had been said in the Silver Spoon Diner that night, but it was said with a completeness of intention that made eloquence beside the point. Margaret looked at him for a moment. She said, "I know you are, Kevin. Get some sleep." He nodded. He glanced at Danny with the expression of someone who wants to communicate something and is not sure of the right form. Danny gave him the same quiet nod he had given him earlier. Kevin put his jacket on and went out the back. Earl Hutchins was the last of the regulars to leave. He put on his coat, taking his time with it, the way he took his time with everything. He reached into his jacket and took out his wallet and placed a bill on the counter beside his cup. Margaret looked at it. $50? She said, "Earl." He said, "Don't." She said, "It's too much." He said Ray would have left the same, and then he would have said it was not enough. She looked at him. He was not looking back at her. He was working the last button on his coat. She said, "Thank you for staying in the room." He looked at her then. He said, "I have been staying in this room for 35 years. It is not something that requires thanks. It is just where I am on Friday nights." He put on his hat. He looked at Danny. He said, "Your father was the best kind of man, the kind that makes the rest of us wonder if we are doing enough." Danny said he thought the same about other people. He never thought it was about him. Earl said, "That is the mark of it, is it not? The ones who are doing the most never think they are doing enough." He looked at Ray's wall one last time. Then he said goodnight to Margaret, and he walked out of the Silver Spoon Diner at 8 minutes past 1 in the morning, the same way he had walked out every Friday night for 35 years, and the door swung shut behind him. Then it was just the two of them. Danny sat down at the counter, not at the stool at the far end where he had spent the evening, at the one directly across from where his mother was standing. He put his hands flat on the surface and was quiet. Margaret stood across from him. She poured a glass of water and set it in front of him. Then she poured one for herself and leaned against the back counter with it. They were quiet for a while. Not the quiet of people who have nothing to say. The quiet of people who have so much to say that they are determining which part of it belongs to this particular moment and which part belongs to the rest of their lives, which would continue and which would provide other moments for the other things. Danny said you should have signaled me earlier. He said it without accusation. It was something he needed the record to contain. Margaret said, I know. She looked at her glass. She said, I kept thinking he would stop. I kept thinking there was a point where it would be enough for him and he would move on. Some people have that point. Danny said he was not that kind. She said no. I figured that out around the second steak. There was something in her voice when she said it, the faintest edge of irony, and Danny looked at her when he heard it, and she was looking at her water glass with the expression of someone processing something from a slight distance, the way you look at something that was serious and is now also in some specific way absurd. He said you were not scared. She said when I fell, yes. Before that, no. He said how. She was quiet for a moment. She set her glass down. She said you want to know what I thought about when he was saying those things. Not what to say back, not how to handle it. I thought about your father. I kept thinking about what he would say if he were watching. Danny waited. She said he would say, handle it, Maggie. You have got this. And he would go get himself another cup of coffee and let me deal with it. Danny said because he knew you could. She said because he knew I did better without someone standing beside me being worried. He understood that about me from the very beginning. Most people, when they love you, they stand close when things get hard. Your father understood that I needed room. He gave me room. But he was always where I could find him. She looked up from the glass. She looked at her son. She said, I think you might have learned that from him. Sitting at the end of the counter where I could see you but not feel you hovering. Danny said I learned it from watching him watch you. Margaret looked at her son for a long moment. The fluorescent light was doing what it always did, making tired faces look a little more human, softening the evidence of a hard evening. She said he would have been proud of you tonight. Danny looked at the counter. He said I did not do very much. She said you did exactly as much as needed to be done and not one bit more. That is the hardest thing. Most people do either too little or too much. Finding the exact right amount is what your father spent his whole life practicing. He was still getting better at it when he died. She put her glass down. She said, I think you have gotten pretty good at it. The closing routine of the Silver Spoon Diner was a sequence of small tasks that Margaret's hands knew independently of her mind, a physical knowledge accumulated over 19 years of closing this same space in this same order. She wiped down the counter. She covered the pie cases. She counted the register and recorded the number in the book. She turned off the lights in the kitchen and the back hallway and the small office where the manager kept his paperwork. She did not rush. She had never rushed this part. The closing of the diner was its own ceremony and it deserved to be done properly. Danny sat at the counter while she worked. He did not offer to help. He had offered once years ago and she had told him she did it better alone, and he had believed her and had not offered again. He sat with his water glass and he watched the room go dark by degrees as she moved through it. Ray's wall was the last thing the light left. The overhead fluorescent went off and the diner went dark except for the small recessed light above the photographs, the one that Margaret had installed herself the year after Ray died, the one that stayed on until the very last switch at the door. In that final light, the photographs were very clear. Ray in his dress blues. Young formal, the photograph slightly overexposed. Ray and Margaret laughing on their wedding day. Ray with the keys to this place the day he had made something real out of nothing. And Ray in the hospital bed holding her hand, looking at the camera, both of them smiling with everything they knew and everything they still had and everything that was coming and the absolute refusal to be reduced by any of it. Danny looked at the photographs in that last light. He thought about a man who had come home from 2 tours of a war that had tried very hard to keep him, who had built something good with his own hands, who had given his family a place that meant something, who had spent 30 years negotiating a peace with a piece of metal that had been trying to kill him since 1986, who had done all of that quietly without asking for recognition because in his understanding of things, doing what needed to be done was not something you got credit for. It was simply what you did. He thought about sitting at the end of that counter every Friday for 7 years. He thought about his mother moving through this room with the ease of water moving through a landscape. It had shape knowing every table and every stool and every regular's name. He thought about the green bracelet she had never taken off. He thought, I do not come here to protect her. I come here because this is where he is, and I am not ready to stop being near it either. He did not say any of that out loud. Margaret came to the door. She had her coat on. She looked at Danny, and then she looked at Ray's wall one last time, the way she did at the end of every shift, the quick private acknowledgement that was not visible to anyone who was not paying close attention. This time, she held it a moment longer than usual. She said quietly to the photographs or to the room or to no one in particular, tonight he would have been proud. Then she switched off the last light. Ray's wall went dark. Outside Lancaster County at 1 in the morning in October was cold and clear. In the way that the middle of the country gets cold and clear in autumn, the sky very large and very dark above the flat reaches of the highway, the stars visible in a way they never quite are where people are concentrated, present and numerous and indifferent in a way that either diminishes everything or contextualizes it depending on the night and the person. The parking lot of the Silver Spoon Diner was empty except for the 5 Harley-Davidson motorcycles in the far corner and Danny's truck near the entrance and Margaret's sedan beside it. The 4 men who'd been standing at the entrance had gone at some point during the taking of statements as quietly as they had arrived. They had not said goodbye. They did not need to. They would see Danny on the road or at the chapter house, and the evening would become part of the shared history of the group carried without ceremony, referred to, rarely understood completely. Margaret stood outside the door and breathed the cold air. Cold, she said. Cold, Danny agreed. He was standing beside his bike. He had a helmet in each hand. One was his. The other was the one he kept for her, the full-face black helmet he had bought 3 years ago and kept strapped to the back of the bike every Friday because she would not ask for a ride and he would not stop being ready to give one. She had declined for 2 years. She looked at the helmets. She looked at the bike. She looked up at the sky for a moment at the stars over Lancaster County, clear and very far away. She said, my knee is going to be stiff by morning. He said, I know. She said, I'm probably not going to want to drive. He said, probably not. She held out her hand. He gave her the helmet. She put it on. He helped her fasten it without being asked and without making anything of the fact that he was helping, the way you help someone with something practical when the help is just practical and nothing else. She swung onto the back of the bike with the careful efficiency of someone whose knee was already beginning to stiffen and who was not going to make a production of it. He swung on in front. He started the engine. The sound of it filled the parking lot, that particular deep Harley resonance that carries in the night air the way few sounds carry, that rolls out over the flat Pennsylvania landscape and fades with a completeness that makes the silence afterward feel very full. Margaret put her hands on the sides of his jacket, not around him, on either side of his waist lightly, the way you rest your hands on a surface you trust completely. He pulled out of the lot and onto Route 9. The highway was empty in both directions. The white lines came at them out of the dark and went under them and disappeared behind. The speed built slowly and smoothly. The cold air came at them steady and clean. Margaret did not think about the evening. The evening was the evening, and it was over, and it had produced what it had produced, and tomorrow it would begin the long process of becoming the past, which was where all evenings eventually went. She thought about Ray. She thought about the way he had looked at her on their wedding day off, to one side of the camera, laughing at something she had said, not staged, not posed, just caught in the middle of being entirely and helplessly delighted by her, which was a thing he had been for 43 years and had never tried to be less of and had never apologized for. She thought, I told your son he was proud of him tonight. I do not know if that is exactly true, but I know you would have been. I know you would have come home and made coffee and sat across from me and not said much, and that would have been enough. She thought, I know you are watching. She thought, I am okay, Ray. I am okay. The bike moved through the October night, and the stars were very clear above the open country of Lancaster County, and Margaret Calloway held on to her son and let him carry her home through the dark. The Silver Spoon Diner stood in its parking lot with its lights off. From the highway, it was just a shape, a low building with a sign that caught a little of the passing light when cars went by, which was not often at this hour. It looked like what it was, a small diner on the side of a road in the middle of the country, the kind of place that exists without fanfare in 100 counties in a dozen states. The kind of place that has been in the same spot for so long, it has become part of the landscape, not remarkable to anyone who does not know what it contains. Inside in the dark, the booth sat empty. The stools at the counter sat empty. The coffee pots were cleaned and resting. The pie cases were covered. The kitchen was still. The register was closed. And on the wall near the front door, in the dark, where no one could see them, 4 photographs in their frames were exactly where they had always been. 3 weeks after that Friday night, Vincent Rosario was formally charged with misdemeanor assault in the second degree. The charge was supported by 4 separate video recordings from 4 unaffiliated witnesses and the sworn testimony of 6 individuals. His attorney described the evidentiary situation in a word that he chose carefully and did not elaborate on. Marco DeLuca retained separate counsel 6 days after the incident. The nature of his subsequent cooperation with certain investigative processes is not a matter of public record, but the cooperation happened and the people who needed to know about it knew. The charges against Vinny did not make the front page of the Lancaster newspaper. They made page 7 a brief item. Most people who read it had forgotten it by the following morning. The people who were in the Silver Spoon Diner that Friday night did not forget it. The people who were in the Silver Spoon Diner that night carried it the way certain things are carried, not displayed, not forgotten, simply present. Earl was back at stool number 3 the following Friday at 11 past 11, same order, $50 on the counter. He did not explain the amount, and Margaret did not ask him to. Pete Farrell does not process things through words. He processes them by showing up, which is a more honest form of processing than most. And he and Donna were at their booth the next Friday, and the Friday after that, ordering the same thing, sitting in the comfortable silence of a long marriage that has lately been given one more thing to hold together quietly. Kevin Marsh is still in the kitchen. He makes 3 kinds of pie from scratch now, and a biscuit recipe that a regular long-haul trucker once described somewhat dramatically as the best thing he had eaten north of the Mason-Dixon line. He has not been late once. And every Friday night when the dinner rush has thinned and the highway outside has gone quiet and the yellow light has settled into its familiar warmth over the red vinyl stools and the worn laminate tables, a large man in a flannel shirt comes through the door and takes the stool at the far end of the counter. He puts his baseball cap down beside him. He does not look at his phone. He does not read anything. He sits and he watches the room in the way of someone who has learned through long practice that being present is itself a form of work, that showing up without being asked is itself a kind of saying. Margaret Calloway sets a cup of coffee in front of him before he asks. He nods. She nods back. The lights hum. The coffee steams. Outside, 5 motorcycles sit in the far corner of the parking lot in the dark, patient and still. The Silver Spoon Diner stays open, the same as it always has, the same as Ray Calloway built it to be on a cold October morning in 1987, with his own hands in the county where he had chosen to make his life, with a piece of Beirut still in his chest and 30 years ahead of him, and not one moment of any of it that he would have traded. Some things are worth building. Some things are worth keeping. Some people understand that from the very beginning. And some people walk into the wrong room on the wrong night and sit across from the evidence of it and understand it perhaps for the first time when it is already too late to be the kind of man who would have known it sooner.